What's up, everyone? Welcome to another edition of the Open Doors Ready NIL Masterclass. Today's guest is a really important guest because we're going to have a really important conversation about mental health, mental well-being, with name, image, likeness, this NIL brand building experience being another thing for athletes to worry about. You got to still focus on the mental well-being on the other side throughout the entire process. So today's guest is Emmett Gill, who has worked in college athletics, worked in sports for a number of years and has lots of experience working with athletes at all levels. He'll kind of walk through some of those conversations that athletes have been having, athletes should be having, and kind of give some best practices and some insights in this whole journey. So Emmett, thank you so much for joining.
Oh, no, Chris, I appreciate it. I appreciate this and the attention and focus, to mental health in the NIL space.
Yeah, great. So Emmett, every guest gets the same first question, but I'll ask you the same question to you because it's important, right? We always talk about the why when it comes to personal brand building, NIL. So more or less, Emmett, what is your kind of path to today and your why to what you do every day?
Yeah, I guess, Chris, it started when I was a learning specialist at the University of Maryland with the football team. And, in that capacity, you learn a lot about the young men and the young women that you're working with. And I just noticed, because I was also getting my terminal degree at the same time, that mental health was a challenge. It was a focus, and knew at the time that there weren't many people who were focusing on that space outside of the folks at the University of Michigan. So as time progressed, at North Carolina Central University, University of Texas at San Antonio, and then the University of Texas at Austin, just really wanted to focus on mental health and wellness because I understand or believe that it's essential in terms of athlete success, both in the classroom, on the field, and in life. Mental health is a lifelong journey. So, I've been working in this space for a while and just really excited at the increased attention in this area.
So mental health is something that's becoming more more prevalent in conversation with athletes today. In fact, I believe it was kind of a key piece of the rewrite of the Constitution for NCAA, right? So when I say mental health, you, Emmett, say what?
Well, first I think about dimensions, right? I think about mental health across different dimensions. So you've got biological, you've got the social, you've got the psychological, you've got the spiritual. And so first of all, I think about those dimensions. And then the second thing I think about, Chris, is whether or not those dimensions are in balance, right? And so when I think about balance, I think about a continuum. Am I doing really well here? Am I doing okay? Am I coping or am I struggling? And so I really think about it like, it's like the old equalizer that DJs used to have back in the day. How do I sound? Is everything sort of in balance? That's what I think about when I think about mental health. But there's also the other side, the wellness. What am I doing? Like, what am I doing to focus on mental health and wellness? Starting the conversation is so important, but it's also what you're doing in between the conversations in terms of your mental health workouts. So I think about dimensions, I think about balance, and I think about workouts.
And one of those things that athletes can do is something that you've been working on, kind of something that you're really excited to get going. It's called Athlete Talk. It's the idea of an app on an athlete's phone where athletes can go through exercises daily and have those kind of that path forward clearly outlined for them. What are some key features of Athlete Talk, and really how does it help an athlete maintain their wellness around the mental health side of things?
Yeah, we're really excited about Athlete Talk. Well, in terms of the key sort of features, the first is our social media wellness feed, where athletes, it's very similar to what you see on Instagram or Facebook, where there's a feed, and the feed includes different tips with regard to mental health, quotes with regard to very normal concepts related to mental health, whether it's kindness, whether it's gratitude, whether it's self-care, whether it's staying true to your identity. And then the second key feature are multi-day plans. So we have plans on mental health, we have plans on wellness, personal development. But one of the key features is that these plans are only about 3 to 5 minutes. They include a couple of thought and or action exercise after each plan. And then you have the third feature where athletes are able to journal, whether it's about the plan, whether it's about their day. We know that journaling has a positive impact on mental health and wellness. So what we're trying to provide, Chris, is simply another resource for athletes to either read the plans or listen to their plans and get some quick burst of wellness. I go back to the workouts piece, and with a tool that fits within their schedule.
You kind of outlined your journey, your path a little bit earlier, and what that also speaks to is the fact that you've been dealing with athletes, again, all levels, number of years, different types of generations of athletes. But this idea of mental health, mental well-being is not something that is new. It's just often being talked about today where it wasn't before. What are some of the common things that you've seen in athletes when it comes to dealing with their mental health? Some of those common themes.
Yeah, I think the first common theme is a challenge with vulnerability, right? That's not something that's consistent with being an athlete. I'm not going to be vulnerable. Or if I'm being vulnerable, it's just a trick play, right? I'm not supposed to be vulnerable. So that's one of the things that we have to confront up front. But when we talk about sort of those disorders that we commonly see, one is anxiety, right? It's either performance anxiety on the court, or it's performance anxiety in the classroom, or it's just performance anxiety, or just what we call imposter syndrome in terms of athletes being on campus and not really feeling that they belong on campus. And then I think the second most common challenge is our adjustment disorders. And it's an actual disorder that's named in the DSM-5. And that's simply where athletes are adjusting to different roles, whether it's the role on their team. Now maybe they're not the best on the team, or they're not getting the playing time that they think they should receive. Or it might be their schedule, getting up at 6, 5, 4 a.m. in the morning and making adjustments there. So adjustment disorders. I think the third piece really is substance use. And it's a different kind of substance use because oftentimes it comes with peer pressure, or it comes with the thought of it's my coping mechanism. It's the way that I self-medicate. And so, of course, with the legalization of marijuana, we've seen an increase in marijuana use, but we've seen a persistent, use of prescription medication and alcohol amongst athletes. And then the last one I would say is really COVID. COVID has had a tremendous impact. And I don't know if we'll come out with the new name of the disorder based on COVID, but that would certainly be warranted, because that includes a few different things that are common, loss and grief, trauma, again, the anxiety of stopping and starting, the adjustment disorders. And so I would say, again, it's the anxiety, it's the adjustment, it's the substance use, and then all of the implications that have come along with COVID.
Let's unpack the vulnerability and anxiety piece just real fast, because I think it speaks to the brand building and/or NIL experience for a lot of athletes within the last 12 months and plus, right? To share your brand, to build your brand, to work your way to NIL activities requires you to be a little bit vulnerable and share more about yourself. Athletes have been dealing with the anxiety and being vulnerable for a long time. What are ways to kind of not always overcome it? Because I don't want to create this perception it's easy to overcome or it's possible, but like how to navigate the negativity of being around anxiety or being vulnerable. Like what are ways to kind of empower yourself around those areas?
Well, I think the first thing is, and a lot of athletic departments have the student athlete development piece, right? And we've moved in student athlete development in terms of really figuring out who you are, right? Because if in the sport of basketball, if you're a jump shooter or you go to the basket, you have to figure out what you do well. And so I think one of the ways to combat the vulnerability is to work on your identity development, have an understanding of who you are, and have an understanding of how who you are can relate to your brand development. And therefore you feel more confident, whether you're shooting the 3-pointer, the jumper, whether you're, endorsing a car dealership, or whether you're endorsing, some encyclopedias, whatever the case may be. You have to know yourself. And then I think the other piece is really, once you understand who you are, seeking out opportunities to play that role, to fulfill that role, whether it's on campus, whether it's amongst your team, whether it's in your athletic department. It's not just identity development, but it's also identity formation. And you pursue that formation through practice, just like you would, in your sport. And then I think the other piece is, that's really important in terms of being vulnerable is that you do have to find opportunities where you need to grow, right? Growth is always, somebody says, what, if you're not hurting, you're not growing, right? So you have to go through and have to be willing to go through some of those trials and tribulations, not just to figure out who you are, but to figure out who you are not, right? That's so very important because you don't want to try and fulfill a role that's not consistent with who you are. And again, we hear that sports analogy all the time, do what you do well. And so I think that those are some of the things that can help with the vulnerability of brand development. But with the understanding, as you and I know, that, there are going to be some risks. There are going to be a few, scars and scratches, but remembering that's who makes you who you are.
I think it's really fascinating because I think we always want this to be a perfect exercise, right? This idea of brand building, brand development. I know who I am. It's going to go exactly how I laid it out. And of course, we all know that's not how it works, right? Like it's imperfect, but that's exactly what it should be. And so one way that I kind of see it play out is in social media. You always compare yourself, whether you mean it or not, to others, because that is your idea of what you're seeing as considered perfection. We tell athletes this all the time, but can you speak to the idea of authenticity and why that matters and maintaining mental well-being in whatever process you're going through, brand development, identity at school, team, whatever it may be?
Yeah, I mean, and just in talking about the comparisons, right? I think this is really important that why are you making the comparisons? First of all, like we can make these random comparisons to, other athletes, whether they're, at the same level, Division I, Division II, Division III, or the same conference, or even the same school. So why are you making these comparisons? But if you decide, to be vulnerable and make those comparisons, then, have a purpose and actually engage in some learning because, you don't want to compare apples to oranges. If you're going to make comparisons, one, you want to learn from them, but two, you want to compare yourself to the individuals who are in similar circumstances, and also individuals who might have similar goals to yourself. But I think the key is not to make too many, to be constructive with it, right? For it to have a purpose and to be constructive with it. And then again, have a goal. What are you going to do with this information and how are you collecting this information? But my advice to college athletes would be not to do too much, not to do too much of that, because in this NIL space, I think there are a lot of backstories, right? You don't know the backstory around the company. You don't know the backstory around the school, but that school may be different to be promoting brand development, may be different from your school. But at the end of the day, if you are trying to learn and not trying to be critical of yourself, remember, don't be critical, be constructive. I think that it can be a good exercise for college athletes.
And one thing about mental health, it always seems to come out as somewhat of a reactionary thing, right? We always got to deal with mental health because I'm feeling something. But, it's like anything, you want to be preventative or proactive. And one thing that I love is the idea of mindfulness. Obviously, you're aware of mindfulness. You obviously believe in that as well. For an athlete who may be hearing that for the first time, what is mindfulness and what role does it play in maintaining mental well-being?
Yeah, mindfulness is a form of meditation, right? And so it really emphasizes a couple of things. One is the ability to focus on your breathing. One, diaphragmatic breathing and being able to practice that. Two, the ability to focus on your breathing. And three, in focusing on your breathing, the ability to stay in the moment and let judgments about yourself pass by. And again, returning to focusing on the present and focusing on your breathing. And so, Chris, when we think about mindfulness, we think about, first of all, being committed to having a set time or at least, a commitment to doing it every day. And then second of all, finding the space. Next, good posture. What posture makes you feel comfortable? And then, you can have guided meditation, whether it's someone speaking or music, or you can start to engage in the diaphragmatic breathing and focusing on your breathing, deep breathing in and out. And there's judgments because things are going to pass by. There's so many thoughts that pass by in the mind in a given day, much less 10 minutes. Then just trying to remove yourself from those judgments or those other thoughts that you're having and just focusing on relaxing and focusing on the moment and focusing on the breathing. And people might say, well, how is that going to help me? Well, you just said it earlier. You said, oftentimes we're reacting to something. And when we're mindful and in the moment, and we sprinkle a little gratitude on that, then maybe our reaction in that moment is appropriate. It's not compromising, it's thoughtful, because we've spent 10, 15, 20 minutes per day practicing how to stay in the moment. And people believe, and I think it was Rick Pitino who said it, the precious present, right? You always want to be in the precious present. And I just think mindfulness is an incredible tool, especially when athletes and others learn to pull on it in that moment when they need it.
That's only one proactive way to manage, mental health, and right, like mindfulness is really powerful. But you talked about journal writing earlier. Like, what are some other ways athletes can be proactive in this space?
One, commitment. Just whether it's a conversation with yourself, whether it's a conversation with a coach, whether it's a conversation with a family member, just making the commitment. That's critical. And then one of the other things that I really talk to athletes about is what relaxes you. Like, what do you do outside of sport that when things are going haywire all around you that you can depend on? And something that doesn't have anything to do with sports. Can't have anything to do with sports. You can't say I'm going to go out and run and you're on the cross country team and that's what you do for relaxation. So find that thing that you can do. The third thing is, do you have a trusted person in your circle who you can talk to? Do you have somebody? And it could be mom, it could be dad, it could be a sister, brother, it could be a teammate. But do you have somebody who you can make that 2 a.m. phone call to, when you can't sleep and things are going wrong, that you can have, a conversation with? And then, Chris, what I encourage athletes to do is package all of those. Because once you package that, you've got a plan. Like, you've got a mental health and wellness plan for yourself. And, over the course of a month or a couple of months, you may subtract some things, you may add some things. If mindfulness is a part of it, you might go from 7 minutes to 12 minutes. But the other piece is that once you have that plan, that you can engage in some continuous evaluation of it. And it's no different than what you're going to do when you're in the weight room. If you're talking about putting together your plan for a workout, it's the same thing. But I go back to the first point. You've got to be committed to it.
You just mentioned inner circle, and I love this conversation for athletes because this is not something they have to do on their own. They can choose to do it on their own, but they don't have to. And one of the ways not to do it on your own is having an inner circle or people around you, a team, to manage life or just manage expectations, have good conversations. What are qualities that you would recommend an athlete find in people to bring into that inner circle? And also, it's kind of a two-part question. The second part is, what are the pros and cons of an inner circle? Like, what have you seen athletes kind of been benefited by, but also hurt by?
And that's a great question. In terms of attributes of who are you going to have in your inner circle, especially when it comes to brand development, we hear this a lot. You've got to have some know people in your inner circle. You've got to have some people who feel comfortable with being critical but constructive, with you. And I think you've also got to have somebody in a circle who, knows the authentic you, like really, really understands, who you are. And then the other piece I think is important in this brand development space is to have some people in your circle who got some skills, right? Because I was listening to an entertainer today, and he was like, I really don't like social media. So I have somebody who's doing the social media for me. And whether or not that person is doing it or whether or not they're providing you with information on how to do it, I think that you have, it's really difficult with all the athletes have to do to know all the nuances that are required with brand development, whether it's writing, whether it's, the photography and the way they look or whatever the case may be. So having some skilled people on your team, having a know person, having someone who authentically knows you very well. And third, having somebody who has some skills that will complement what you're trying to do in this NIL space. With regard to the pros and cons, it's a challenge, right? Because athletes are used to being, as perfect as they possibly can be. Athletes are are not used to being vulnerable, right? And so those are some of the negatives that can come about it. But again, I think the positive part is that you're going to grow. You're going to grow and you're going to learn. One of the things that I hope athletes really avoid is sort of this, sometimes athletes have guilt and they don't bring around the people, and they don't bring the people who've been in their circle in the past, and they don't bring them along for the ride. I think that could be a mistake. I think, you really need to protect that inner circle when it comes to NIL brand development. It could be different from your other circle. You know what I'm saying? It could be different, but you cannot have people who are amateurs in this space with you. You got companies, like Open Doors. You've got the people in your athletic department. You got to depend on them, and you got to be a little bit vulnerable and a little bit trusting of them, in order to protect yourself against people who they have your best interest in mind, but they don't have the skill set that you need. This is like developing your own team, and you have to do the best that you can because you're the general manager of that team.
That's a great way to put it, for sure. You've mentioned this a few times, the idea of identity or struggling with identity, but it's really important to the idea of brand development is identifying who you are. For an athlete who is not aware that they're going through this kind of identity crisis, what are some signs that athletes can know, like, I need to pause, I need to think about this a little more? Like, what have you seen in athletes know that it's basically triggering this identity crisis or this kind of imposter syndrome?
I think it's what you're saying earlier, man, in terms of, do you have the tendency where you're comparing yourself to what others are doing, right? Because when we talk about, the self, we talk about the I and we talk about the me, how I see myself and how others see me. And so really, when you're emphasizing how others see you more than you're emphasizing how you see yourself, then, that's ultimately a challenge. I think, there's some subtle things, rapid changes in routine, just because you may have read something, just because, someone else is trying that strategy, rapid changes in different routines. But the other thing I think is important is when you've got trusted people in your circle and they're sharing information that's constructive with you, and you're not listening, like you're avoiding, or you are, really not accepting and willing to listen to what they're saying. I also think that is a sign that you could be struggling with your identity development. And then, of course, other things. Are you trying new things? Like, if you are on a college campus and you haven't necessarily maybe gone and joined the club, or college students have an opportunity to go to different events for free, those are the things that you really want to engage in to expand your identity, because that's where you're going to see and experience things that you haven't experienced before. I mean, like, if you're a football player, you've never gone to a baseball game on campus, and you've never experienced a great hot dog. You could be, a brand ambassador for a great hot dog company, but you've never really tried it before. And I think it's, Chris, I think it's those small things. I really think it's those small things. So the last thing that I'd say, in terms of, identity foreclosure, or the flip side, identity development, is seek small opportunities. Seek small opportunities to do different things. And it's so hard for our college athletes because they're so regimented, right? Wake up, I go to weights. Wake up, I go run. Then I shower and I go to class. After I go to class, I go to practice. After practice, I go to team meeting. And then I head to study hall. Well, in this new age of NIL, you're going to have so many opportunities to experience things that you've never experienced before. You just got to be, going back to vulnerability, you just got to be vulnerable enough to try some of those things.
Oh, that's a really good point. I think I love the idea of like small things, right? Like, it doesn't impact bigger things if you manage it in a smaller package. That makes a lot of sense. We'll end with this conversation with this last kind of point, and it's more or less just kind of capstoning this whole thing. An athlete, whether they're first year athlete, second year, third year, they hear about NIL, they hear about brand development. They say, hey, I want to commit to this. I want to commit to this part-time job of making money around my name, image, likeness, and I got to develop my brand. They come to you and they say, what is your best advice for me to navigate this from a mental well-being standpoint? And you say what?
Well, first I'd say you got to listen to all the master classes that are being offered by Open Doors. I think that's critical. But the other thing I think is important is just sort of integrating your interest into your education, right? I mean, there are classes on campus that talk about, communications and presentations, there's campus writing, there's photography. There's so many different things that are being offered that you have a scholarship for and that you're entitled to, that will allow you to sort of learn about some of the things that you need to learn about. But I'll even take a step back and saying, when you want to enter this space, just understand that this is a lifelong endeavor, right? Our brand goes with us throughout life. And so that's really important to realize. And I think, based on some things that I've been reading as of late, Chris, on NIL, I think that part of it has also got to be about things that you're not going to do anymore, right? They've got to be about things. If you're going to be out there in the public spotlight, then there are certain things, that you're going to have to say, you know what, I can't do that anymore. That's not, that's not a part of who I am, because you've really got to think about this. It's not just about the money, but it's your brand. You know what I'm saying? It's like when you go to Starbucks, you go to Target, or you put on a Wilson glove, or you put on some Nike shoes, there's some expectations around that. And so sort of realizing what that entails also, it says to us, there's some things that we've got to do, but there are also some things that we may no longer be able to do, and having an understanding of all, sort of what comes with that. But I think, just to wrap that up in a package, it's really got to be about being authentic, and figuring out ways to work smarter and not harder as you develop your brand and your brand identity.
Nope, it's absolutely right. And we try to get that in front of the athletes as much as we can. So I really appreciate you reemphasizing it from this standpoint, right? Like, this is going to be a mental well-being conversation they have internally with other people, whatever it may be. So I appreciate you kind of coming at it from that frame and providing all the insight you have today. So thank you so much for joining, and thank you for kind of sharing your perspective and the experience you have in this space.
No, I appreciate this. I appreciate all the work that you're doing. And yeah, thank you so much.